MG Rob back with you, and today we're finally getting around to trying to get that SU carburetor actually onto the Jeep. So let's get going. Alright, so I got my adapter manifold here and a carburetor loosely bolted to it at the moment. But before I worry about how I'm going to make it actually operate with the cables and the linkages that are on the Jeep, I'm going to worry about actually getting it mounted onto it and see if I can get the jetting close enough for it to actually run right. Then I'll worry about spending the time and effort to do all that other stuff. So like I said in a previous video, I ended up choosing to use the HIF4 carburetor versus the HS4 carburetor because the throttle has to rotate the wrong direction. I'd have to push it rather than pull it, so it wouldn't work for this application for me to try to make the linkages hook up. Now the difference between these are, when I say HS, that means it's got a side float bowl, and the HIF has an integrated float bowl into the bottom, or integrated float, with the bowl being on the bottom here. Now these are sized in 1/8 inch increments generally, and with some of the original carburetors just being 1 inch, so they were just H series carburetors. Now the number denotes how many 1/8 of an inch bigger than 1 inch the bore of the carburetor is. So an H2 would be 1.25 inch carburetor, H4 would be 1.5 inches, an H6 would be 1.75 inches, and a H8 would be 2 inch. Now these are a constant velocity variable venturi carburetor, which works off basically the opposite principle as the original carburetor on the Jeep worked on. So the velocity of the air going through the carburetor remains relatively constant, but then as the piston goes up and down, when it's pushed up and down by the air, it creates more and more air volume. Now it doesn't have any accelerator pump on it. What it has is it has this, like a piston in the top, and there's a spring up there with oil in it. It acts like a shock absorber. So when you snap the throttle open, the piston doesn't just slam all the way atop. It slows it down, stops it, temporarily increasing the speed of the air through the carburetor so that it draws more fuel in. And the jetting on these things is actually pretty, I would say a pretty simple idea, but not so simple to get them just right. So the jet comes up through the bottom of the float bowl. This is the jet. It's got an 090 opening in it here, which there are other, the bigger carburetors like the 2 inch ones have 125. But then the needle, which is in the bottom of the piston here, is obviously smaller than the 90, and then it's tapered to the bottom, and they have hundreds of different profiles of how it's tapered, and the different series carburetors have different length needles too. But the difference between the outer diameter of this and the inner diameter of this determines how much fuel comes out. And then as you accelerate and you get more air going through it, and the piston goes up, it pulls up out of there, and the more it pulls out, the bigger the opening becomes and the more fuel comes out of it. So what I was figuring on this thing, since it puts out a roughly 70 horsepower, if I were to look at a needle chart and pick out a needle profile for a twin carb like B engine, like a race engine that's putting out roughly 140 to 150 horsepower, the needle that would be equivalent use for that would be what I would want as a starting point to work with on this. And instead of buying needles, what I'm going to do is actually change the diameter of this needle. Now, of course, dial calipers isn't the absolute best way to measure these things. Not quite as accurate as a real set of mics, but this is what I've got to work with, and it'll be fine for what I'm doing. So you would measure them, and I forget the exact number, but it's like every 1/16 of an inch, I think it is. They measure them all the way down the length of it, and that is the profile. So what I need to do is just take like wet dry sandpaper and basically sand on this and thin it out until it gets to the thickness that I think is going to work to be rich enough and get me in the ballpark. Now if it turns out it's not rich enough, then I can just sand more off and make it more rich. If it turns out it's too rich, I can just start with another needle and make it not quite as thin. And so that's the basic idea of what I'm going to do to try to make this work on that. Of course, before I can put that carburetor on it, I gotta get this one off. I have heard that these Indian-made carburetors actually weren't very good, but I didn't hear that until after I'd already bought it. And I did find out that it does evaporate out very quickly because it's got a very large vent hole in it. So if it sits for a week, the carburetor float bowl is pretty much empty of all fuel. So I got my adapter here that I built. Now the gasket that was on there is still there, still looks good. I'm just going to reuse it and bolt this thing on. Alright, so there's the SU sitting in place. Now I still got to clean this carb up a little bit and put a couple seals in it. Because usually, even though the HIFs are really good carburetors and they don't get a lot of wear on them, the choke side of it, the seals can get hard and then the choke doesn't work right. Now of course I'm going to have to get this fuel line over to this side. And then once I get it running and everything's working right, then I got to figure out how to make all of this work together. Now a lot of MG people don't actually like the HIF series carburetor. They like to stick with the HS. But one of the things I do like about the HIFs is they have these seals here at the ends of the throttle shafts. So dirt doesn't get in there. So you rarely ever see wear in the throttle shafts where you have to ream them out and put larger shafts in them like you do with the HS series. Now I'm not going to do much for cleaning this thing up until I know it's going to work either. So just doing a quick clean, make sure there's no dirt in the float bowl. Just spray it down, and then I'm going to replace the seals in the choke assembly. So here's the choke assembly as it comes out. This seal here is generally what needs replaced. They get hard and they can crack, and that's the single biggest problem with the chokes on these. But a new O-ring fixes that right up. Now the HIF series carburetors and the late HS carburetors used this style needle, which is spring loaded to what they call a bias needle. Now these are much harder to chuck up into, say, a drill and thin out than the earlier needles here. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to build a hybrid by using the dash pot and piston from an early HS so that I can use this style needle, which is easier to modify. So in order to modify these, early style, it's easy enough just to chuck it into a drill, which you can use a hand drill or a drill press. And then you can take a fine file or something like 400, 600 grit wet dry sandpaper and just work them until you get it down to where you want it. Now, one nice thing about this setup here is these are infinitely adjustable by doing this. So you can literally jet this to work on any engine if you just get this taper correct. So if you're too lean and idle, you're going to take some out here at the thickest part. And anywhere else you're too lean throughout the RPM range is lower or further down on the needle. So now I've just modified this as a stab in the dark of what I think might get it running. And we'll just try that out and see what happens. Alright, so now we're going to try to start it for the first time. Now when I tried to bring this thing in, I could not get it to stay running at all. Apparently my fuel pump failed. I couldn't get any fuel at all coming through the fuel filter. So I got my good old-fashioned redneck fuel system that I use for getting parts cars going all the time. We just gravity feed it to the carburetor. These carburetors only need a pound of fuel pressure to operate properly. So I guess we'll see if I can make this do anything. Of course, this thing's got a foot switch for the starter, and it's really hard to operate. You know what? It might help if I turn the ignition on. Well, surprise, surprise. Sounds like it's not running on all 4 cylinders right now, though. But that's good news. That means I can work with what I got. All right, well, that's the Jeep running on the SU carburetor. Now, of course, it still needs some fine tuning once I sort out the ignition issue that's going on. And of course, I'm going to have to get a fuel pump on it before I can actually drive the thing and sort out the fine tuning and making sure it's fueled enough under load and all that stuff. But we're making a lot of headway here. So, as always, if you like what I'm doing, like, subscribe, share, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you know when I have new videos coming out. So, this is MG Rob. Later.